Yes, that does.
Good morning and welcome to our second forum of the new program year. The topic of today's forum is the pandemic church. Where do we go from here? And here we are on Zoom, so we've all seen how the pandemic has affected Trinity Church in the short term. Many of us are now wondering how it will affect Trinity and other churches longer term, and how we'll need to continue to adapt to a world that will probably never be quite the same again. And we are blessed at Trinity Church to have who I think is the best possible person to address these questions, Donald Romanek. Donald and Margaret split their time between Hartford and New York City, where Donald is president of the Episcopal Church Foundation. In that role, he interacts with parishes and church organizations across the country and beyond. Having him in our congregation is a great opportunity for us to stay up to date on what's working and what isn't working in parishes across the church. So thank you, Donald, for leading this session. We're all looking forward to it. Please take it away.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
First of all, I just want to add my warm welcome to Dee Littlepage, our new rector. Dee, you're here somewhere. As you recall, you went to VTS with our son, David. And David speaks very highly of you and is thrilled that you are our pastor and priest. David is rector of Church of the Heavenly Rest in Abilene, Texas. So where we've been able to connect with him and hear him preach during this lockdown. As Mark said, we kind of go back and forth from New York and Hartford. We're members of both Trinity here and St. Bart's in New York. Our office is opened technically, but only a couple of us are there. New York is still pretty quiet. Most of the office workers have not come back. We go to in-person dining this week at 25% capacity. As you heard this past week, the Metropolitan Opera canceled its season. Broadway will probably remain dark for a long time, and most New York churches are still doing virtual only. So first of all, many of you have attended my forums in the past where I kind of give all kinds of gloom and doom news. And there is some downside news here, but I think also upside as well. But let's go back to last fall. And right around this time in October, the wider Episcopal Church introduces or sends out their parochial reports. Their data from the parochial reports, and last fall would report on 2018 parochial reports. And last fall, what I would have reported is that once again, there has been a 2% decline in active membership of the Episcopal Church and a 20% decline over a 10-year period. And once again, there was a 4.5% decline in average Sunday attendance, or a 25% decline over 10 years. Some of my priest friends, when they look at the data, they say, okay, so we have 20 more Easters before the Episcopal Church is totally out of business. Now, I guess if you just look at the numbers, that's not one way of looking at it, but obviously those aren't the only numbers that count. The median average Sunday attendance in 2018 was 53, down from 60 in 2014. So when people say, well, we're a small congregation, we only have 75 people on a Sunday, I say, actually, you are a fairly typical congregation in the Episcopal Church. And then in 2018, the average pledge was about $3,000. And maybe many of you know that Connecticut has one of the lowest average pledges in the country, even though we have one of the highest per capita incomes. And one of the highest average pledges is in the state of Mississippi, the Diocese of Mississippi. But that's a whole different conversation. Now, there's also the anecdotal data that I've been hearing, and I think I've shared with you previously, where most bishops, especially those in the Rust Belt, including our own, often speculate that 1/3 of their congregations are financially sustainable for 5 years or more. 1/3 are marginal, and 1/3 are basically ready for hospice care, which means in danger of closing or reconfiguring in some real way. Okay, so let's jump ahead to those dark days of early 2020, where 2020 was going to be the year of all kinds of amazing things in the church and the world. Interestingly, I was my last airplane trip, and I traditionally have traveled a lot, usually 75,000 miles on Delta a year. Now my travel is back and forth on Metro North to New York, where I don't get any miles. I was in Diocese of Texas in Houston with Bishop Andy Doyle, who's a real creative, fun guy to hang out with. We were at dinner, and we heard through Episcopal news service that one of the bishops, and I don't remember who he was contemplating shutting down online worship because of COVID-19. At that point, we were calling it, I guess, the coronavirus. And Andy and I kind of laughed, saying, "Oh my goodness, can you believe this? Can you believe that this is happening?" So we're here together the night the Episcopal Church shut its doors. And lo and behold, a couple weeks later, this bishop obviously was ahead of the pack. Everything shut down. I remember closing the office on the 17th of March, which is St. Patrick's Day. And the night before Margaret and I going to our favorite wine bar on the corner of 2nd Avenue and 49th Street, and saying goodbye, thinking that this will probably be a 4 to 6 week ordeal. We even started a lot of house projects early on during the lockdown, thinking we wouldn't have enough time to complete them all. And we could have painted the 3rd floor, the 1st floor, the 2nd floor, and the exterior of the house in the time we had during the lockdown. During the first 6 weeks, in addition to adjusting from working home, I probably spoke to about 25 diocesan bishops, often by Zoom or calls. These were bishops I have had some prior relationship with, and just kind of finding out how they're doing and what's keeping them up at night. Obviously, people were in a crisis mode at that point, and a lot of these bishops were just, having regular contact with their clergy to make sure everything was okay. Answering rubrical questions about, Eucharist and all this kind of stuff. And then they were starting to think about, Holy Week and Easter. And at that point, I think many of us were still optimistic that we'd be able to have an in-person Holy Week and Easter. And some bishops said, well, I don't know about that. Maybe Pentecost, maybe Trinity Sunday, maybe Advent 1, I don't know. And when I asked many of these bishops how their congregations were doing, they once again would say, well, those congregations that were stable before this pandemic will be stable going forward. Those that are marginal are marginal. And I began to use a metaphor of my cherry trees. Outside of my home office, we have these 2 big cherry trees, which once bore cherries. They still do, but they're mostly there for shade. They provide wonderful shade over the deck. And we had like an April snowfall. It wasn't a storm, but I get a call from the arborist saying, oh, we want to come and prune your trees. And I said, in the snow? He said, yeah. And they couldn't get the heavy equipment down the driveway. We have a very narrow driveway. So these strapping guys kind of climbed up the tree and started pruning the trees manually. It was fascinating. I even have pictures of it. But I started using the metaphor with my bishop friends and others is that those cherry trees, you can either get the arborist and prune them artfully and strategically, or the windstorm or the ice storm is going to come, and those branches are going to come down one way or the other. To extend the metaphor is that often in the church and in the world and in our own daily life and work, we don't do the pruning necessary in advance of the ice storm or the windstorm. And what is happening and what will be happening is that a lot of branches in our beloved Episcopal Church are going to come down. And we're going to have to decide how we deal with the trees and the branches that are left. But more in a minute. So we have a virtual Holy Week and Easter. The lockdown continues. Margaret and I make a few day trips driving into New York to get mail and things, and the city is obviously at the epicenter of COVID. The whole issue of systemic racism starts emerging through a variety of horrible actions. Then things gradually begin to improve a bit. There's an economic stimulus in Washington. Many of us get our $1,200 checks. Many of the dioceses and parishes take advantage of the payroll protection program, which buys some time. And now we are at the fall and kind of figuring out, where are we now? There's starting to be some data coming from more ecumenical, nothing specific to the Episcopal Church, which is kind of interesting. You know, when COVID was hitting and the economic blow occurred, according to a report from the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy and the Lake Institute on Faith and Giving, 41% of religious congregations saw a decline in giving and donations during the spring of 2020. And this was based on interviews with 555 congregational leaders from basically Christian congregations. The study also found, and it was conducted in July, it found that from February to June, donations fell about 4.5% on an average basis, ranging from a 10% drop in March to an actual 4.5% increase in May. Interestingly, 65% of Catholic parishes reported a drop, 41% of evangelical parishes reported a drop, and 35% of mainline Protestant congregations. What the study also found is that congregations with well-established online giving options fared better than those who did not. And not surprisingly, the smallest parishes were impacted the most. The study also indicated that looking ahead to next year, that is 2021, 52% of the congregations reported expected their budgets to remain about the same, while the rest, I guess that would be 48%, expected to make any cuts ranging from 5 to 10%. Significantly, none of the congregations who reported indicated that their budgets were going to increase next year. When they were asked about what measures they would do if they continued to experience revenue declines, most were likely to say that they would kind of reestablish fundraising goals, try to increase their pledge income, then cutting non-personnel administrative expenses, drawing down on their endowments and reserves beyond the usual course of events, and finally laying off or furloughing staff. I think what happened and what's happening is that, and it's happening in our own personal lives, is that during the lockdown, we hunkered down. We were worried about, health, safety, toilet paper, groceries, masks, kind of almost, taking care of the day-to-day business of kind of living and breathing. But as congregations move beyond this period of kind of totally online services and look to some kind of reopening, I think they and we are being forced to have some tough and it could be life-giving conversations about what comes next. Interestingly, there was the State of the Plate survey, which is another organization that surveys congregations, although I think they tend to focus more on evangelical groups. They found that 64% of the churches across the country indicated that giving was either up, steady, or about the same. I mean, was either up or steady. A smaller percentage continuing to experience a decline. And in April, that same study indicated that 65% of congregations experience a decline. We have no hard data for Episcopal churches specifically, but anecdotally, we're hearing that for the most part, giving has remained about constant, except for those very small or very marginal congregations that were having difficulty early on. But this State of the Plate indicated that 90% of the pastors who responded reported some level of financial stress for both their families and their churches. Let's move away from money for a while and let's take a look at worship. A survey by the Pew Research Center in April found that 90% of regular churchgoers indicated that their churches moved to online services. ECF did a survey among our Vital Practices subscribers, and that was kind of generally the case, but there was a significant minority of churches who had no contact with their faith communities during the lockdown. They were given links to other services, they were sent, newsletters, but no regular contact. Some of those were kind of congregations, rural congregations, smaller, less resourced urban congregations, and that's really a tragedy, I think, when you look back. But for many of us, and many of us in this room, and many of us, many kind of mainstream Episcopalians, we've had the ability to church shop. And as I mentioned earlier, David, our son David's in Abilene, Texas, and we've been able to hear him preach. He's a wonderful preacher, and that's been fun. We've been tuning into, St. Bart's, other places. People have a lot more options in terms of online services than they had when the only options were really in-person services. And much like our retail spending habits, the online phenomenon, I think, is going to have a fairly permanent impact on the church-going public, including Episcopal Church. Some early indication, that the data seemed to indicate that some congregations were having even more people attend their online services than they usually do in person. But that phenomenon, except with a few exceptions, seems to have waned. And we'll talk about that in a minute. I think much like, during the early part of the lockdown, we were binge watching series on television and Netflix, or baking bread around the clock, or drinking wine around the clock, or both. I think that too has kind of faded as we try to get back to this new normalcy. There's been an upside to moving online. The online coffee hours where you get put in a room with people you would not ordinarily speak to, has been a boon for a lot of people. Some clergy are remarking that they've had more contact with their parishioners than they've had before because people are much more deliberate about it. I'm sure you, like me, when you would call people during the lockdown, friends you haven't talked to in a while, everyone would pick up their phone because they were anxious for human connections. You know, a lot of us here, you know, there's a certain convenience in, you know, going to your living room or your bedroom, turning on the computer and having a worship experience and seeing colleagues and friends and fellow parishioners. But there, I think, is a significant downside. ECF has a program, Congregational Leadership Initiative, where we bring together 12 entrepreneurial priests from throughout the country who are nominated by their bishops with their leadership teams. And traditionally, they do some pre-work. There's a residential program where we have networking and workshops and breakouts. They come up with the project to bring home, and we assign a professional coach to help them get it done. And this past, right after Labor Day, we had a virtual gathering. And I finally realized that we have to, both, at least I do, internally, I have to come to the conclusion that an online gathering of Congregational Leadership Initiative is not meant to replicate the in-person. The in-person, you know, you have meals with people, you walk down the, you know, from the breakouts, there's a reception, a whole different experience. And needless to say, these people are doing some interesting things, but they're kind of down. I mean, this is a downtime. And one priest said, he said, you know, what we're spending our time on is the things we really don't know how to do and not doing the things I really love to do about being a priest. And that is, you know, sacramental, pastoral, being in touch with people, hugs. I mean, Trinity, Synchronicity, I mean, we're all about hugs, and we haven't been able to hug each other for 6 months plus. I think that we have to come to the conclusion, and is that clearly the shutdowns and the pandemic have weakened church connections. The Pew Survey and the Public Religion Research Institute found that 1/3 or more of those who have previously attended in-person services are not bothering to watch online services. And clearly for those whose church affiliation was already tenuous, this disconnect may be permanent. In other words, when congregations do regather in person, we shouldn't be surprised if our average Sunday attendance may be lower, even by 1/3. Then there is music. Wow. Another critical part of who we are at Trinity Church. The suspension of congregational singing and choral singing, I think, has been the most disturbing aspect about the pandemic. And I appreciate Dee's advice at the beginning of the service: sing your hearts out and pray loudly. But even current technology, Zoom doesn't even allow us all to sing together, as we probably learned through Zoom birthday parties. Jennifer Riddell, who is the relatively new bishop of Arizona, did a video message to her diocese about, you know, COVID restrictions, including the restrictions on congregational and choral singing. And she said that she would never have heard a call to the priesthood if she had not found her faith through song. I'm not even sure I would be a Christian today if I wasn't able to pray by singing, she said. But I don't want to kill someone by my prayer or by music. And hence, bishops and and other church leaders have to make health decisions. I guess I'm sure all of us are thinking about the holidays. In our breakout rooms, we were thinking about whether or not kids are going to come home or we're going to travel, what that looks like. And imagine, Christmas Eve, let's say we can gather for a small group of people. And our rectors and bishops say, well, we have a small group of people singing Christmas carols, but you can't sing. Humming "O Come All Ye Faithful" in your mask on Christmas Eve is going to be a different experience. And it's not only Sunday worship, but weddings, funerals, ordinations, first sermons by new rectors. Those are meant to be in-person gatherings and festive occasions. I attended a online ordination, a friend and colleague from the Diocese of Virginia, and they did it well. They were doing it like every hour and a half. It was in St. Paul's, Richmond, which is a big church, and there were about 5 people there. There was the bishop, there were a couple priests, there was the ordinand and his spouse. And usually, one of the great parts of ordination services when all the presbyters come and lay hands with the bishop. And one of the most moving, I think, hymns that almost, I almost go to tears is the Veni Creator Spiritus plain song. And that was an organ solo because there was no singing. Now, clearly, Matthew was ordained and he's a priest, and he celebrated his first Eucharist in English, Spanish, and Polish. He's quite accomplished. But I missed it. I missed something about now being there and giving him a big hug and having a festive celebration afterwards. I think the reality is that we have to give ourselves room to grieve. Now, I know that my issues are first world issues. Donald Romanik isn't stimulated enough and can't hop on a plane and travel all over the country. And I realize other people are losing their lives, their health, their homes, their jobs. But we are all impacted by this, and that we have to give ourselves room to grieve. And the church is a place that I think we need to do that. There's also Zoom fatigue. I'm on Zoom sometimes 5 hours a day. And sometimes I say, I don't need to see your face. Let's pick up the phone and have a good old-fashioned phone call. And I think that's also the reality of online worship. If you're on Zoom all week, sometimes you don't want necessarily do Zoom on a Sunday. So if you see that my camera's off and I'm muted, I'm just taking it in without having to look or have people look at me. I think one of the biggest downsides of this pandemic is for those who depend on the church community for ongoing solace, support, comfort, connections. I mean, that's an important part of a worship experience, and that's a very important part of our worship experience at Trinity. I mean, I think most strangers coming in get that right away. The other thing that I think is happening is that maybe for this 1/3 of people who kind of occasionally attend church, and I'm not talking about here, if they're not getting that sense of connection or bond, they might say, gee, I really didn't get a whole lot out of that. People are making decisions now. I mean, all of us, the things we used to do before the pandemic, we might not necessarily go back to. I mean, I'm not buying lots of clothes. I don't need clothes. I have a closet full of suits in 2 places that I can use for a myriad of weddings and funerals. I mean, I like to go out to eat, but we're thinking twice on whether or not we want to spend a lot of money on a mediocre dinner. We're making decisions on our lifestyles, on our spending, on what we do with our time differently now And I think people are going to make decisions about church attendance in the same way. But, Dee mentioned it again today, our tagline is a place of welcome, hope, and healing. Yeah, that can still happen online, on Zoom, especially for those of us who know Trinity, have been at Trinity. I mean, I find it much easier to Zoom with somebody I've been in contact with personally beforehand, rather than someone I've never seen before. But I miss the smiles, I miss the waves, I missed just entering the space, hearing the kids. How do we maintain that welcome, hope, and healing, not only right now, but as we move into this next phase? Okay, so where do we go from here? I think this is what you're all waiting for. Obviously, these are my own thoughts based on what I'm reading, what I'm hearing, what I'm observing. But I'm firmly convinced that how congregations, including Trinity, respond to this current pandemic now and in the months and years ahead will not only determine our own future, but will basically determine the face of Christianity in the next 5 to 10 years. How we respond to the new normal, how we adjust our economic and organizational models to these new contexts. These are critical conversations we have to have at the local congregational level, at the wider diocesan level, and beyond. I saw one prediction, and or in several capacities, that 20% of Christian congregations will close in the next 1 to 3 years. And obviously, these are congregations or churches that were marginal or had major problems prior to the pandemic. Back to my cherry tree metaphor, the branches have to come down one way or the other. And instead of pruning, COVID has been the accelerant. COVID has been the ice storm or the windstorm taking down the branches. I think like the major airlines are anticipating, the president of Delta got a lot of airtime early on, and Delta's my airline of choice, but they're talking about being leaner, meaner, more nimble, more flexible, more responsive to the changing travel habits of business people and leisure travelers. I will go back on a plane at some point, but I'm probably not going to travel as much. It's going to be difficult to call a meeting where people are coming, even from, let's say the greater Hartford area, and you're sitting around the table having a conversation and serving water. I think when we do gather, it's going to have to be for significant either worship, fellowship, networking, brainstorming. The airlines are aware of that. The hospitality industry is aware of that. Gee, I'm glad I'm not in the hospitality business or higher ed. Canoga Conference Center in North Carolina, I don't know how many people have been there. It's a gorgeous place. The president, I had a conversation with him, they're all about people gathering. And he said that we planted 3,000 daffodil bulbs last year, and there's nobody here to enjoy them. Obviously going through some really hard conversations about what is the role of a conference center going forward. So, I made this prediction before, but I think I'm more confident. I think in Connecticut, in the next 5 to 10 years, we're probably going to have 50 traditional congregations. Meaning by traditional congregations, one rector, one building, one vestry, and the kind of congregations that we all kind of are used to. and a whole bunch of multiple smaller worshiping communities. And it may be home churches or, self-contained groups of people in separate buildings. It may look very different. But those traditional congregations, you might want to call them, resource connecting congregations, are going to have to play a role in bringing people together in new and creative ways. So, who are these congregations going to be? I'm not here to speculate, but it's not only about financial sustainability. There are a lot of congregations out there that have a lot of money, but no passion, no missional connection, no sense of who they are and what God is calling them to be. It's going to have to be, all congregations need to have this thoughtful, prayerful discernment process of what is our clear purpose and mission? Are we well connected to the community? Can we develop partnerships, and not only in name only, but actual collaboration, sharing resources with other Episcopal churches or other ecumenical communities? I'm really thrilled that Dee comes to us with a strong background in collaborative ministry. Dee is a person who knows how to build partnerships and networks with people outside of one faith community. And we need to be able to do that more effectively, especially now, here and now. I often say that, in Greater Hartford, you can almost throw a football from one Episcopal congregation to another. And I realize that we all think of ourselves as unique, but I think we really have to look at more opportunities for sharing resources, sharing ministries, sharing who we are and what we want to do in the community. But back to the present, okay? So we have the past, pre-pandemic. We're going to look at, in the things were so wonderful in the pre-pandemic. Not necessarily. We still had marginalized churches. We still had systemic racism. We still had, the haves and the have-nots. We can't look to the good old days. And we can't replicate what we did before if we are going to be sustainable moving forward. Some people are talking about kind of using the metaphor of a bridge, that we have to have bridge time from the past, kind of the pre-pandemic, and this bridge time also includes giving people time to grieve what was, and looking to a reopening process that is not just getting back to normal, because there's no such thing as getting back to normal, but a reopening process that focuses on the church's critical mission and its essential functions. And I think the leadership of the parish is hearing it through their surveys. There's a significant percentage of people who don't want to come to in-person worship service for a good long time. I mean, some are even saying, till vaccine, or we don't have to do social distancing or masks. And, that may be definitely months, if not years off. And these aren't not necessarily, they're not only the old and the frail and the, pre-existing conditions. There are a lot of people who are not ready to be in in-person gatherings, and we have to respect that. But how do we keep these people engaged during this bridge period? I'm sure you've been hearing it in kind of the secular world, where people have pods, where they have a group of friends who share similar ideas and attitudes towards social distancing and wearing masks and being out in the world, who are gathering for social events. I know David has a pod with some people down in Abilene, so the kids can play together without killing each other, literally. What if we move to some of these smaller group gatherings? What if we establish, not only us, but other congregations, kind of pod groups, a group of people who are committed to the same approach to, to the pandemic in terms of social distancing? I don't know, 3 to 8 people, try to mix it up in terms of single people, younger people, diversity kids. And they get together and maybe even on our own campus for fellowship, for prayer, for worship, for Bible study. Might that work here? Something to think about. And I know that's there's people starting to talk about that in the wider church. The other thing is, even when we go back to in-person worship, we're going to have to maintain an online presence. And I don't know if it should be, a camera filming a bunch of people in person receiving communion where I'm sitting behind my computer and I can't do that. Perhaps in-person online worship has to be a different experience than in-person worship. Do you remember when the books first, online books first came on, they actually kind of, they turned the pages and you could almost smell the mustiness. Or, sometimes online newspapers still do that, but when so you can read the Hartford Current where you turn the pages online, or you can go to their website where it's a whole different setup, a whole different way of reading the news that meets people in different places. I think that online worship may need to be a different experience than just filming or videotaping or live streaming the regular service. Then there's, back to money. While I think, throughout the church, evidence seems to indicate that people are kind of maintaining their level of support. I think this is going to be an absolutely critical stewardship season for us, for the wider church. And this may be the year for the old-fashioned every member canvass, calling people, seeing how they're doing, and asking them for their commitment to Trinity. And we may also understand or hear why people say, I just don't feel connected to that place anymore. And obviously we're going to not, mourn that fact, but at least we'll know that. Because this is going to be an indication of how people feel about their connectedness to Trinity. And we've done a good job. I know the vestry called people early on. You have newsletters. There's been a lot of communication, but some people are going to just feel disconnected and either not come back or say, okay, I'll send you a check for $250 when their pledge might have been substantially larger. Back to my earlier discussion about our own personal spending habits. I know that faith communities are different, and pledging is, you pledge out of a sense of gratitude to all-loving God. But there's going to be a certain it's going to be an economic decision for a lot of people about what they value and what it's worth. And I think we have to be prepared for that. We have a new rector in place, thanks God. This is a time, and I know we did this when we put together the profile and went through the rector search, but that Trinity is gone and never coming back. And I know that's stark. All of our lives are different now than it was 8 months ago. And unless we accept that, cry a little, mourn a little, we're not going to be able to move forward. I think this is a time when we at Trinity, the leadership and the entire parish, what is absolutely critical to our identity, purpose, and mission? What do we need to do by ourselves? What do we need to do on that campus of Trinity Church, Sigourney Street? And what can we do in partnership or collaboration with other people? The other thing that this pandemic is clearly bringing full force fully frontal is the issue of buildings. It's clearly happening in the workforce. We're not going to need all these big office buildings if people are basically working from home and only coming to the office on an occasional basis. I myself am reassessing our lease comes due next spring, and we may only need half that space. What about church buildings? We have a lot of space. And I know we have a capital campaign and we're addressing some needed improvements, but what is the role of space, buildings, grounds as we move forward in this brave new world? Is our current missional and business model sustainable? We have a lot of wonderful things going on. The choir school, Trinity Academy, all the stuff that we do. Is that a sustainable missional and business model? And everything, they're all wonderful programs. But as we look to the next 3-5 years, all of these things have to be on the table. Then we have so the past, the present in terms of, getting through this pandemic, the bridge, the future. But we also have the present. I mean, the pandemic has become politically polarized. We have an election. We have the whole racial injustice issue. We have a Supreme Court appointment. We have economic realities. We have the crazy stock market. We have the spiritual well-being of our people. Our church leaders are facing incredibly complex decisions. How we respond to the new normal, how we move from point A to point B in a thoughtful, prayerful, Jesus-centered way, as Dee said earlier, accepting Jesus as who we are, our being, is going to not only determine our future, but it's going to have a profound impact on the people who call Trinity Church their spiritual home. And how we navigate these uncharted waters are going to really determine what we do, how we do it for at least a decade, if not beyond. Okay. Questions, comments, pushback?
So if anyone has a question or something they would like to add to the discussion, please just either raise your virtual hand or try and give a signal if you're on video, and I can unmute you and you can join in.
And you can also add a comment to the chat if that's easier for you.
I just one of the ideas that you put forth about these pods, I don't want to lose that. We have a great tradition at Trinity of these foyer groups that have helped to build community within the church, and I see that idea of pods within the church as a logical extension of that into the future.
Dee.
Yeah, I'm very grateful for the tone of hopefulness. Feeling very kind of hopeful. I think a lot of times the conversation is, starting with those statistics about the church is dying, and then it ends with, so what do we do? But I feel very encouraged and hopeful about a way forward that is different from whatever has come before, but is still very much grounded in who we are as a Trinity community and who we are as people of God. So thank you.
And Dee, when I especially, when I meet younger clergy leaders like yourself or David or a lot of your colleagues, it really gives me hope, because what you bring to the table is, you're grounded in the traditions of the faith and the Episcopal Church, but you're bringing fresh eyes, from your own personal life experience and saying, no, folks, we can do this together. It may look different, but we can do this together. So I just want to, just thank you for who you are and being among us, as well as your colleagues throughout the church. So. Yeah, Roy's putting in his chat about renewing personal connections. And I think those have been strained, I'm not without blame. It's just the nature of the beast. And I think, the pods or just continuing opportunity, even the virtual coffee hours, just giving people an opportunity to see familiar faces and hopefully new faces.
Go ahead, Mark.
You're unmuted.
Okay. I was just curious, as we continue to try to develop our online worship, if there are particular models out there or congregations that you think are worthy of taking a closer look at and learning from.
Yeah, I mean, there are some congregations that, National Cathedral, St. Michael and All Angels in Dallas, which have kind of really involved, multiple cameras and close-ups. And one priest I was talking to, he had a theater background. He goes into makeup before he goes to his Sunday worship service. That might be a little much, but what I've also heard is that maybe the online worship becomes more conversational. So maybe it's, one person in front of a screen with a suitable backdrop. Maybe it's just, saying morning prayer together or something of that nature. And especially, we're not going to kind of out-glitz the glitzy parishes that are doing online worship and virtual choirs and all that. Maybe we need to do something that's very authentic and consistent with who we are and what we do. Even I know David does Compline, I think on Sunday nights, and he gets like 150, on Facebook, and it's just, he chants Compline and 20 minutes, from his dining room, and people connect with that. So I think we need to do something that's uniquely us. And now with Dee here, I'm sure she could help us figure what that might look like.
This is Drew. One of the great blessings from this time I've had, it has been our breakout rooms and our chances to chat in prearranged little mini pods or something. I think that we've had conversations that have been far more broad and far deeper than ever we have on Sunday morning. And if we can find some way to further that with some kind of system for shuffling us around also, so that we could have the chance to meet with people who may be very different from how we look or how we think or where we live or whatever within the congregation. That's been such a blessing for me of this time. How could we continue that blessing in some new ways?
Yeah. In my own organization, we would have, I have people from all over the country, and we would have periodic staff meetings where, I'd report on what was going on and people would ask questions and everyone would and then during this pandemic, this lockdown phase, it's been much more about dialogue, not only checking in where people are, but, having kind of missional strategic conversations about where we're going or, what the church may look like and how we respond and all that. And it's been very rich, and probably I would not have thought of that, or other people would not have thought of that, but for this kind of lockdown experience. How do you grasp, how do you keep the good of these, unfortunate situations? I mean, you hear stories, from my mother, the depression. Depression was awful, but 40% unemployment. But she has wonderful memories of people coming together and, I have a loaf of bread, you have a pot of soup, let's get together, and people just having connections that were a lot more intimate and intense than they would be maybe under so-called normal circumstances. That's a good point.
Kate, go ahead.
I guess I just, wanted to share with the wider group that, Clement and I share youth Christian formation. I did a write-up that I gave to Martha that I think she's passed on to Dee about sort of the status of things at Trinity. And right now we're in a holding pattern because we know that kids are completely exhausted by Zooming for school. We had Jane and Margaret should have been confirmed this spring and we're not. And who knows when it will be safe for a bishop to lay hands on them. And so we're missing some of these milestones in our kids' lives, and the little communities that we've built in our church school setting really don't exist in the way they did before, and it seems hard to come up with something that's going to be safe and actually meaningful for the kids. I'm so glad that choir is back, that choir school is back, and that they are able to be in person, even though it's socially distanced in church with the handbells once a week. But it's definitely going to be a big area for us to rebuild when we are able to come back. And I welcome people's creative suggestions that do not involve or some way to make the Zooming not as burdensome, because school just really drains them. So yeah. That's all.
Thanks. Frank had some things to add.
Right. Donald, thank you very much for your presentation, which was both realistic and hopeful at the same time. One of my questions would be, what has been the experience of clergy in this period with regard to pastoral visitations? Is there any data being collected on how that's working and we know what the downsides are? Are there any upsides in any way for pastoral visitations via Zoom?
Again, anecdotally, pastoral connections with people who aren't in crisis have been going very well. But in terms of being with people who are dying or with their loved ones who are dying, that's been a lot more difficult. I know, and I'm not sure what's happening here, but I know a lot of places now allow the clergy to go into hospital rooms if they're properly with proper precautions and protections. But that, you hear all kinds of horrible stories about, people dying alone and not having their priest with them. And if you're in a hospital bed, a Zoom screen isn't going to really do it for you. So all over the board, Frank, nothing, and maybe Dee or other people might have more recent experience that they could share.
I've had some folks who've shared on Facebook about doing last rites over Zoom and talking about how it was not the same at all as maybe being able to do it in person, but it was better than nothing. And the family, because the families couldn't go to the hospital either, and so them all being able to be on Zoom was comfort to the family. And so it was, people are doing it, and also trying to figure out ways when there's not technology available. There's not Zoom available in the hospital room. It's still a question that people are figuring out as they go along from people that I've been talking to.
Go ahead, John, you were going to speak to the pastoral care? John? Did you have some response to the
Yeah,
simple care
just
question?
a comment. I find myself being very grateful. I've only been a couple of years, but considering the building, the excellence of worship, the magnificent choirs, and the acolytes, and the coffee hour, and the exquisite experience of the vestige of a really excellent, what would be a large church. But I consider that's pretty much in the past, and I will treasure that. I can't envision ourselves going back to the building. I just can't see us going back to the building. We have St. John's, we have the Cathedral, Grace, St. Monica's, and Trinity. All of these magnificent buildings. Somehow, I put my faith now in Dee and in the leadership of Trinity, but I'm not so much in the building anymore. I don't know how we will get back to in any vestige of the way it was, which is to say I'm grateful for the way it has been and looking forward with faith, but not a clue as to where we're going. But I'm glad I'm along for the ride and want to be part of it.
Thank you, Roy.
Thank you, John. Yeah, it seems like often we're thinking in terms of all or nothing, or even medium or nothing. The church doesn't have to be open for us to worship together, even in person. And I know a few of us in various situations have met for dinner, socially distanced dinner, safely prepared, safely served, and there are instructions in the newspaper about that. You know, getting 2 to maybe 6 people together in a backyard while the weather is still good, who haven't been able to come to the, haven't chosen to come, whatever reason, to the Zoom worship sessions. I think physical, it's just, we all know this, physical presence is what brings us life. It was Jesus' physical presence that brought people life. And we bring each other life through our physical presence. But it doesn't have to be 50 people or 150 or 130 the way we used to have in church. And I think we need to be, if we want to include the people in our community already, and I mean our Trinity community, it needs to be intentional and more than just once. And we're talking about this in the Christian Formation Committee, and but just inviting people over for tea if they're comfortable doing that. If you're comfortable doing that, that might be only 2 people or 4 people. So I think we need to think in terms of different sizes of groups and not think of it as all or nothing, gather or not gather. I haven't met anyone yet, and that's just a yet, who has refused to have a conversation socially distanced. I just haven't met it, but you know, there may be some people who can't or are not comfortable doing that. I acknowledge that, but let's think a little bit more inclusively and intentionally. I'm thinking it's not just, oh, that would be nice to do. I think without building a lot of structure, I think it's just get on the phone and chat. And that's what's authentic to this parish, is like so many Episcopal or church parishes, we are social and we like being with each other. And that's authentic to us, whether it's 4 people or 60. But for now, it can't be 60. Thank you.
One of the other metaphors I use, I love my metaphors. This is kind of a secular metaphor, but the people who were the businesses that were very successful after the Second World War were the ones who in 1944, after the Allied invasion of Normandy, they were building, tanks, to get to Berlin. But they were also anticipating that when the war ended, there were going to be hundreds of thousands of GIs coming home who wanted cars and refrigerators and houses. And I think what we need to do as a church community is kind of deal with the tanks and the planes now, because the battle isn't won, but also starting to think about new creative ways of being on the other side. And I think this is the time to do it. Hopefully the worst is past. Who knows what this fall is going to look like? But at least we can step back and start thinking ahead rather than just dealing with the moment. So that's kind of my advice to us and to faith communities everywhere. So.
Oh, looks like Martha would like to say something.
Surprise. To that end, just following on what Donald just said, the vestry continues to work toward the future. And one of the things that we've been working on this summer is figuring out how we can move forward in terms of racial justice and being a presence in the community within our own parish and in the larger community that cares deeply about that issue and is willing to step out and somehow be there, show up when it's time for us to advocate for, care about, and protect all of the populations that are oppressed, and particularly people of color. So it's important, I think it's terribly important that we grieve for what we can't have right now. And it's equally important that we think about what can we do now, and what will we begin to be able to do very soon that continues to keep us being Trinity Church, because we're a special group, and we've been special all along. So we're working on it. And if you have ideas, if you have input, if you want to be part of that, the vestry is listed at the end of every single service leaflet, and any member of vestry would be glad to hear from you about ideas for moving forward and being more in the community and more of who we are. Thanks.
Go ahead, Mark.
Donald has always been eager to remind me and others that we don't want our services to go too long. So I just want to thank Donald and everyone for participating. Obviously, these discussions need to continue, but we need to allow people to have their days as well. I was wondering if we could ask Dee to give us a closing benediction.
As we go forward. As we go forth from this place gathered together, may the peace of God, which passes all understanding, keep your hearts and minds in the knowledge and love of God and of God's Son, Jesus Christ our Lord. And the blessing of God Almighty, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit be upon you now and remain with you always. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you.
I look forward to continuing these conversations with you all, because we got to figure it out together.
Great.
All right. Bye-bye.